We made this.
Hello and welcome everyone to a podcast devoted to the sounds of cinema and discussion about them between the notes, which is where we come in. I'm Tony Black.
I'm Sean Wilson.
And in our latest episode of Between the Notes, we will be presenting music from and discussing the work of Bear McCreary, Benjamin Wallfisch, George Fenton and more. Plus we begin a top 10 countdown of the best scores of the master, the one, the only, James Horner. But we're going to kick things off by coming back to our predictions from the last time we recorded in terms of the Academy Awards. And I think we both went and we scored a winner, didn't we, Sean? I think we both predicted that Ludwig Göransson was going to win for Black Panther, and he did.
He did, and what the listeners can't hear now is we're both doing smug faces. If only we'd put money on it, right? So
absolutely. Ain't that the truth?
What a tremendous result, and actually, for me personally, I'm sure it's the same for you as well. That was the result that meant the most throughout the evening, because bear in mind, Black Panther made history across all of its categories. It's, I believe it's costume and production designers were the first ever African American women to win recipients of those awards. It was obviously nominated for Best Picture, although it didn't win. And it's become the first ever comic book movie to win Best Original Score. Not even John Williams managed that for Superman back in 1978. I mean, that's phenomenal. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yeah, but that's crazy though, isn't it? Right? I mean, much as this is great for Göransson and, you know, the as you said, the costume designers who won and everything like that. I mean, to not give it to John Williams for Superman is one of those classic sort of Oscar missteps. What did win? Do you know what instead?
1978. I'm going to take a guess. It was Midnight Express by Giorgio Moroder, I think it might have been, which was a peculiar choice, a score that obviously set a trend, but then you look back at it now and you think, more worthy than Superman.
Yeah, it's not exactly aged like as beautifully in that sense, has it? Really? I mean,
no, and it's astonishing to think that no other superhero score until Black Panther had been nominated. I think neither of Danny Elfman's Batman scores were nominated. No previous Marvel Cinematic Universe movie was nominated. Jerry Goldsmith wasn't nominated for The Shadow, which is one of my favourite superhero scores, so overlooked, as Jerry Goldsmith routinely was. Yeah, I just think that the Academy got it right in this category this year. The Black Panther score is brilliant. What Göransson does, mixing Senegalese authenticity with the needs of a Western symphonic superhero score, it's a really hard thing to do. As he told me, Senegal based on rhythm and counter-rhythm, Western music largely based on melody and harmony. How do you bring those two things together? And he did it brilliantly, and it's such an important character in the film. It communicates so much of the landscape and the inner conflict of the characters. Yeah, absolutely one of the categories they got it right this year, and they made history. More than makes up for the somewhat lackluster Best Picture winner, but I don't know if we've got time enough to get into that.
I think it's more that maybe we shouldn't, because
right.
I think everyone really is most people are on the same page about Green Book, really.
I mean, I personally thought The Favourite was going to walk it, because I thought The Favourite was tremendous, and I'm really shocked that it didn't get Best Original Screenplay. I'm really insulted that Green Book got that, because Green Book is not a well-written film at all. It's not one of its strengths. Similarly, I'm surprised that A Star Is Born slipped so far down the ranks. When you consider when it emerged last year, everyone was tipping it to lead the Oscars, and it didn't. And it won for Shallow, which is a brilliant duet by Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper, and they performed it live at the Oscars, which was great. But I'm so delighted that Black Panther got it for score, because it's a trend-setting score that I think hopefully that will embolden future Marvel filmmakers to give more authority to their composers in terms of coming up with a musical language, rather than just coming up with tonalities and rhythms. Hopefully now more composers will feel emboldened to go, oh, okay, we can actually create the sound of a landscape.
Well, yeah, hopefully starting with Pinar Toprak this month with Captain Marvel, which is coming out. As we record, it should be out imminently in the next week or so. So I hope we will discuss that in some respect, whether we play the music or not. We will discuss it probably on the next episode of Between the Notes, because we're really looking forward to that one and seeing what she does. So exactly, yeah, it might continue that trend. Just to go back to the Superman issue, I've had a look. The 1979 Oscars, as it was, the 51st Academy Awards. So you were right, Sean. Well done.
Was it Midnight Express? Oh, okay.
It was, yeah. Marauder. Your annals of knowledge haven't failed you there. That's pretty good. And it was up against, so obviously you had Superman, and the three other failures that didn't win were Heaven Can Wait by Dave Grusin, Days of Heaven by Ennio Morricone, and The Boys from Brazil by Jerry Goldsmith. So the fact that Marauder won when he's up against Williams, Morricone, and Goldsmith, maybe the three best composers of certainly the last half of the 20th century. It's pretty amazing, isn't
it? The inanity of that decision comes out when you describe it like that. And of those. Days of Heaven, I would put in my top 10 Morricone scores. The Boys from Brazil is a masterpiece, so I'd put that in my top 10 Goldsmith scores. I'm not familiar with Heaven Can Wait, but what a phenomenal year that was for film music. It was just extraordinary.
I think it probably was in essence one of those things reflective of the time. It's sort of the era of disco, and Marauder was coming up with all these new sounds and all that kind of thing. And I think in some ways you could apply that to Black Panther's win, in that it's won at a point where the cinema of African American people has become much more of a big talking point. There's a lot of, justifiably, quite rightly, plaudits going to filmmakers and actors and things like that. But even if you take that away, it doesn't matter. Any of that doesn't matter. The simple fact is the music is amazing. The music is brilliant. So even, yes, okay, it might have been given a boost given the current climate of certain things, but doesn't take away from the fact that score deserved to win, I think.
I completely agree with you. I think that the Academy have quite rightly realised that the music helps define the film as a cultural moment. It's a watershed moment in terms of how superhero movies, particularly Marvel superhero movies, how seriously they're taken. And I think the creativity inherent in the score has become one of the real talking points about one of the main talking points about the project as a whole. You just think of the use of the talking drums, the use of Baba Mal's voice in it. There's so much going on in the Black Panther score, rhythmically, melodically, thematically, and I completely agree with you. That score sums up the intelligence inherent in the film and why people should feel compelled to take comic book movies more seriously, because there is real creativity going on in it. I think that's the stage we're at now with this particular franchise, with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yeah, I'm just beyond thrilled that won, and beyond thrilled that we predicted it.
Back pats all round.
Yeah, exactly.
And well done, Academy. Less well done on Green Book, but you can't have it all, can you?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the Oscars if they didn't drop the ball in the most important category. Because let's face it, the Oscars always drops the ball in at least one important category.
It's what they do. They're on brand, So we'll give them that, really. But yeah, well done, Black Panther. Well done. Okay, so that was 2 Tuesdays from Happy Death Day to You. I feel like I always have to sing that. Happy Death Day to You, which is by Bear McCreary, which is his second score for the Happy Death Day universe, after in 2017 he provided the music to the first Happy Death Day movie of what is becoming a franchise. Jason Blum producing, Christopher Landon directing, and it's very much sort of a horror version of Groundhog Day, which a lot of people will have seen. But I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to talk about it on Between the Notes is because I don't know about you, Sean. I think that Happy Death Day and Happy Death Day to You don't have scores that reflect them being a horror movie. I think these, and Happy Death Day to You builds on what the first one did. They're scored like a different genre, and it's really strange. I mean, what do you think? Do you agree with that? Because when I listen to them, I'm like, this doesn't sound like a horror film.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think Bear McCreary is a really witty, clever composer, and he's got a great sense of like knowing irony, which meshes really well with the tone of both of the films. I mean, you think of what he did on The Walking Dead and what he did on 10 Cloverfield Lane with like the blaster beam. You know, I can't remember the and then the score outside Star Trek: The Motion Picture that uses the blaster beam, but he brought it back, and he's really interested in texture and tone and being playful. He's a really playful composer in his best work. You think of Colossal, the Anne Hathaway movie that he scored as well, which is basically an intimate monster movie score. I think is probably the best way I can describe that. Yeah, he's clearly playing off Christopher Landon's very, very witty script in both films, because there are lots of ideas. There's the character of Tree, brilliantly played by Jessica Roth, who is the one who ends up being stuck in this time loop with her own serial killer. In the first score, it starts off as this kind of sort of slightly ditzy, like pop-infused theme, which then matures and hardens and gains in orchestral stature over time. And that theme is reprised in Happy Death Day to You. And then there's also But what I was reading, what Bear McCreary did for the theme for The Killer was he used the voice of his own infant daughter and sampled it and distorted it, and you've got this like wailing sound effect. He's got a good sense of humour, and I think, yeah, when you listen to both these scores, they're far more clever and more ironic than you would expect. I mean, particularly in Happy Death Day to You, which becomes increasing, the movie itself becomes increasingly untethered from the whole Groundhog Day meets Scream thing. It encroaches on the world of science fiction, and clearly what that does is that allows Bear McCreary to become increasingly liberated from the tropes of slasher movie scores. The score sounds like an epic science fiction Steven Spielberg score at times, deliberately so, which is really funny. It's amusing to listen to, and it works. It's really well written. It's good music.
Yeah, it's great music, and I mean, I haven't seen either Happy Death Day films. Actually, I've not seen the first one yet. And you know, as I said in the last episodes, you know, me not seeing the films that we're talking about is going to become a running theme, the new ones. But I should have really watched Happy Death Day by now, and I haven't. But you know, when I remember listening to the score before, you know, and it really stood out to me. You know, quite often you'll get horror scores that feel very, very much tethered to the movie that they're off. I mean, this month we've had a film called The Prodigy that's coming out, and the music for that probably works very well in the context of the movie, but when I've listened to it outside of the score, it does nothing for me. You know, it doesn't stand for me as a piece to enjoy. Whereas Happy Death Day, there is a real, you know, rip-roaring sense of, like you say, it has those science fictional elements. It reminds me, it feels like McCreary edging a bit more towards Michael Giacchino territory. You know, and having that sense of adventure, that sense of, you know, bombast, and I think he's been growing that way, like you say, through the both Cloverfield scores, both of which are very good. It feels like he's been growing that way for some time. Yeah,
absolutely, and I think that thematically he's becoming a more confident composer as well, because in Happy Death Day 2, given that you haven't seen it, I won't give it away. The idea is that the source behind the time loop is explained in the form of this machine that the other college students have made that allows for this really brassy, sort of spectacularly symphonic theme. There's also another theme which represents Tree, Jessica Roth's character, her relationship with her family, particularly her mother who has passed away, which is actually very, very emotive and very beautiful. It's far more beautiful than we've got any right to expect given this genre. Like you say, normally slasher movie scores are normally, fairly predictable, and yeah, you're right, this doesn't sound like a slasher score at all. It sounds more like an adventure score, and that there is a penultimate piece of music which appears to be alluding to a future movie in this series. Those who've seen the film will know what scene I'm referring to, and I imagine that what the plan for this series is that it's going to become increasingly divorced from where it started, which is ditzy sorority girl locked in a time loop with the person who wants to kill her. I think it's going to move increasingly far away from that, and it's going to embrace seemingly elements of like superhero franchise movies. I mean, if Bear McCreary is still attached to it, just think of the possibilities.
Yeah,
that'll be quite an interesting progression across these scores if that does happen. I think
it's exciting. I mean, if it happens at all, because I know that the film hasn't done very well commercially, so we might not get Happy Death Day 3-2, 3U, 3U, or
Happy Death Day 33 and the third.
Right, exactly. So we'll have to see, really. But I mean, these two scores stand as really great pieces. I think this is one of my favourites of the year so far. Happy Death Day to You. So McCreary's done a great job. I'm excited to see what he's going to come up with next. So yeah, this one is well worth picking up. It's available now from Backlot Music, so check it out. Okay, so after we did our top 10 2018 scores last time, going through the best music that we didn't get to cover when we didn't have a podcast last year, we got our heads together and we thought, that was quite a fun format, wasn't it? Counting down 10 different scores. So I said to Sean, why don't we do every 2 episodes, why don't we do a different composer and talk about our top 10 albums from the best composers and the most interesting composers and things like this. And it made sense to start with one of the greats, really. And, you can't get much better than James Horner, can you really? So we're going to go down over the next 2 episodes from 10 to 1. And in this first little section, we're going to go from our 10 scores down to our number 8 scores on our list that we've been busily going through all our Horner music and putting these together. So, Sean, why don't you kick us off? What's your 10th favourite? And obviously this is a hard list to put together because Horner's got dozens of great scores. But what's your number 10 of James Horner music? Yeah,
just before I reveal what it is, can I just say you're a very cruel man for making me do this? This was really difficult. This is really hard asking me to whittle down my favourite James Horner music because he pretty much wrote the sound of my childhood, as I imagine he did with yourself and most people our generation as well. Anyone who grew up in the 80s, 90s, James Horner's music was synonymous with that era. I'm going to start with an 80s classic, Aliens. So 1986. Horner's first Oscar-nominated score. Getting to that point wasn't easy, as anyone who's seen the behind-the-scenes documentary about the making of the score will know. This was one of the most difficult scores for any composer to put together because director James Cameron and producer Gail Anna Hurd were not helpful at all. The edit fell massively behind. James Horner ran out of time through no fault of his own. The facilities didn't allow him to do the electronic experimentation that he expected to do, and despite that he pulled together one of the sort of darkest, most brutal and one of the most brilliantly militaristic scores of that decade that defined the sound of the film and helped move the film away from the sort of biomechanical artfully designed surrealism of the first movie, which was directed by Ridley Scott and scored by Jerry Goldsmith, the sort of militaristic nature of Aliens, a lot of that comes from the music, which it's some of Horner's most phenomenal action writing. You think of like Ripley's Rescue, Futile Escape, Going After Newt, Bishop's Countdown, which was used in so many trailers throughout the mid-90s, which was that last track was the last thing. He threw that together at the very last minute, and it became one of the defining action pieces in any film. The use of snares, timpani, kettle drums alongside the symphony orchestra is just this magnificent. It's not an easy score to listen to. That's why it's not higher up. I think there's a lot of bleak kind of atmospheric noodling around, which works very well in the film, but it's quite hard to listen to outside of it. But yeah, it's one of the quintessential Horner scores, I'd say.
Yeah, it's great. Combat Drop immediately is where I go to in my head. You know that,
which wasn't even used. It was replaced. Yeah, one of the many things that they fell out over that wasn't used, and then the same fate befell Jerry Goldsmith on the earlier film. It's strange, isn't it? Really,
it is crazy because that particular piece of music, you know, when you listen to it on the album, really stands out as a really great piece of music, you know, and it's sort of Horner's riffed on that a lot in subsequent scores and things like that. So it's a great album to a great movie. So yeah, great choice. My number 10, I've gone for another mid-80s piece, very different one, and I've thought, I suppose, a little bit outside the box with this, and a lot of people may not agree with me, but I've gone for Commando.
See, I start grinning. For me, it's weird. You just have to say Commando. It's
Well, Commando, obviously, it's the Arnold Schwarzenegger starring film as John Matrix, who has to go and rescue his daughter from the most camp and brilliantly hilarious villains. I mean, if you've never seen Commando, then I can't tell you how much fun you're missing.
Like frankly, what the hell have you been doing if you've not seen Commando, really?
What have you been doing? Yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough to watch it. Me and a few of my friends went to an Arnie marathon overnight last year at the Prince Charles Cinema in London, the great Prince Charles Cinema, and Commando was first on the bill, and I can't remember being in a cinema where people laughed so hard. I mean, but in fondness, like, you know, it's a comedy. It's become a comedy now for so many reasons, and the music in, especially the title track with the really sort of 80s trumpet,
and the steel drums and things like that.
Drums. It is perfect in a way. It's perfectly, and it's different. It's quite different from a lot, or it seems to me to be quite different from a lot of what Horner does elsewhere, you know, in a lot of his other scores. So, you know, you'd listen to it and you might not necessarily think, oh, that's James Horner. But it's one of those scores that just really fits a film well. And Commando has become one of those movies that he didn't realise how funny it was. It didn't realise what it was doing, I think, at the time, fully. I think it's become one of those films where time and just evolution has made that grow more fond in the minds of people. So yeah, it's an odd Horner choice, but I couldn't leave Commando out because when I watched it last year, I was like, the music's great. I love the music for this.
I think it's an admirable choice because not a lot of people would pick it, and like you say, a lot of people would forget that Horner scored it in the first place. I don't know how on earth he came to score it in the first place because it's not the sort of film that James Horner would normally have done. But yeah, it's an interesting choice.
You know, even then he'd done, I mean, that was 85, I think, Commando. So even then he'd done Wrath of Khan and he'd done Search for Spock and various, you know what I mean? Or the film scores that track more with, you know, a lot of the other things he'd done. But yeah, I love it. Yeah, you must have seen Commando. If you haven't, get on it. Honestly, you won't have many more fun 90 minutes watching the movie. And
if you're a James Horner fan and you haven't heard his score, be prepared because the sort of synthesised campiness of it is very tongue-in-cheek and quite odd.
It's brilliant. I love it. So yeah, that's my unorthodox number 10. So what's your number 9 then, Sean?
My number 9 is Brainstorm, which is a film that a lot of people might not be familiar with. This is a real cult movie from the early 80s, directed by Doug Trumbull, sort of renowned special effects designer. And yeah, it's an odd little film. It stars Crystal Walken and Louise Fletcher, and it's about sort of brainwaves and sort of mind manipulation. It's a strange little movie. But James Horner's score is brilliant, and it gives so much character to the movie. And one of the things the score does very, very well is it flip-flops between really elegiac beauty and moments of incredibly dissonant and shrill horror, and you're not quite sure where the flip is going to come. This reflects the sort of contradictions in the story. I think the main reason why I picked it is because there's a track called Michael's Gift to Karen, which is among the most beautiful pieces that James Horner ever wrote. And I don't say that lightly, because James Horner wrote more beautiful pieces of music than a lot of other composers. It's just stunningly beautiful. There's a string arrangement and the piano arrangement in that particular track that's really great. And on the flip side, to make my earlier point, there's a track called, I think, First Playback, which has got incredibly shrieking avant-garde choral effects in it, which are really frightening, actually. So the frightening music in it anticipates what he would do later in Aliens. So yeah, I think it's among James Horner aficionados, this score is held up very, very high. I'd say among casual listeners, they might not necessarily be aware of it, but I would encourage people to go back and listen to it, and to watch the film as well, because the film's really interesting.
Yeah, shocker, I've not seen the film, but I have listened to the score. It's coming up very soon for me, actually, on my list. So I think you may have got me into this, actually. I think you might have put me onto Brainstorm, because I haven't seen the movie, so I wouldn't have been aware of the score. But it is really quite frightening, as a piece of music sometimes. It's beautiful, but it's also quite scary. And he manages to weave all that together so well, as you've described. Yeah, it's a great. It's not very long as an album. It's the one that's certainly on Spotify right now. He's fairly short, really, but it's some great music on there. So it's definitely one to dig out, really, because it's a cracker. My number 9 then is Bicentennial Man from 1999, which starred Robin Williams as an android based on the novel The Positronic Man by Isaac Asimov, and it's a film by Chris Columbus. I mean, it's a decent film. It's very schmaltzy. It's very Hollywood schmaltzy. But I love the music to this. This feels like more like the Horner, the melodious, soft, quite melancholy, sad Horner that you'll get in some of the later scores, I think. Yeah,
I think one's response to this score, it very much relies on how generous you are towards Horner himself, how much you're disposed towards his notorious tendency to self-plagiarise, because as everyone who follows Horner's music will know, he was not precious about stealing motifs or even entire passages from his earlier scores, or indeed from other composers, either working in film or otherwise. And I think, to be honest, I don't really remember this score that well. I vaguely remember the movie being a load of whiffling nonsense. It's one of those slightly sick-making, Robin Williams family movies that he did, every now and then. I remember the score being a patchwork of pretty much every Horner score that I'd heard up until that point. And again, if you're a sucker for Horner like I am, he gets away with it. I'm not sure if there are any marks for originality, though.
The film is nice. I think you've got to be in the right mood, I think, for it. It's quite long. It goes on for quite a while. And it's quite a long spanning story. I think if you're generous to it, I think there's stuff to enjoy. But I do like the music. I really do. It's very pastoral. It's very relaxing. It is Horner coming up with some quite beautiful melodies. So I really like that one. It's definitely better than the film. Even, like you say, it is Horner pilfering a little bit from himself. So yeah, that's my number 9. What's your 8 then, Sean?
Number 8 is The Rocketeer from 1991, I believe. Well, we actually, funnily enough, we were talking about superhero scores earlier and comic book scores, and it's certainly The Rocketeer owes itself to kind of pulp comic book style adventures, like retro adventures. And it's interesting that Joe Johnston, the director, went on to make Captain America: The First Avenger, which was scored by Alan Silvestri. I think both films are underpinned by a lovely sense of period detail and just a sort of rip-roaring sense of unironic fun. And The First Avenger had a brilliant score by Alan Silvestri, one of the best scores in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and The Rocketeer has got one of James Horner's best adventure scores. It's so big-hearted and so thrilling, and the brassy main theme, it gives you the feel of flight. I mean, Horner was so good at ensuring that his music embodied the characteristics of the film in question. He was tremendous at that, and just to use the full symphony, just to give that sense of fun. It's one of those scores where I don't know if you would get a score like that for a film now, because it's so unabashed in its sense of orchestral heroism and grandeur, particularly in the main Rocketeer theme, which receives a magnificent end titles summation as well. It works so brilliantly well in the film, and yeah, it's brilliant. Even though at the very end of the end titles, to go back to the wholesale plagiarism thing, there is a wholesale section lifted from Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan right at the very end of the end titles in the score. It's like, oh James, it's like, but we'll forgive you for that because the rest of it is so magnificent. Yeah, I think it's one of Horner's most purely entertaining scores.
That was a bit Bond Girl then. Oh James.
It wasn't it? Could go Alan Partridge. Oh James.
Oh James. Yeah, I mean, it is unusual now. I don't think you would get many scores like The Rocketeer. You're absolutely right. It's a beautiful piece. Yeah, it's a great choice. My number 8, I'm not going to say too much about because it's Brainstorm. So we've just covered that really. So yeah, I can't really echo what we talked about. So that's our top 10 to 8 of Horner scores. We'll be back a bit later to continue the countdown, and we're going to produce our numbers 7 to 5. So keep your ears peeled for more Horner chat. Okay, so that was the title track from Serenity, which is don't laugh, which is the new film from...
Yeah, I can't help it.
I haven't even watched this yet.
No,
I'm
neither
going
have I,
to.
actually, I've not actually seen this yet. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, same. And I'm going to watch it maybe tonight or very soon as we record, because obviously this has been a dual release in UK cinemas and on Sky Cinema, so anyone with Sky Now TV can watch this at home, which is what I intend to do, even though it's been universally panned and derided for some time now. Obviously it came out in the US a bit earlier, and directed by Stephen Knight, starring Matthew McConaughey and Anne Hathaway, with a score by Benjamin Wallfisch, which seems to tap into the sort of old world. You know, it's been described, charitably described as sort of harkening back to sort of Billy Wilder sort of romantic films and things like this, where I think that's being very generous from what I've heard. But it's trying to capture maybe an old world style sense of, you know, nautical romance and things like this. Now, I'm not going to judge it yet, much as everyone's taking the mickey. Let's talk about the score, because I thought this wasn't bad, really. I think Wallfisch is, you know, he's still an emerging talent, really, in many ways, and this certainly feels like a little bit on brand with the kind of, you know, very relaxed, calming, or almost mystical sort of sounds that he's produced. That's what I got from this. It was he really wanted to try and capture a sense of ethereal mystery, I think, with this score. I mean, what do you make of it? Do you think it works as a piece independent of a film? Obviously, neither of us have seen yet.
It's difficult because I like Benjamin Wallfisch's work a lot, particularly his work in horror movies and thrillers. He's really emerged as a really vibrant talent in that, most notably with It, which obviously went on to become the most commercially successful horror movie to date. And his score in that was brilliant, the way it inverted the nursery rhyme themes and mixed it with this lovely wholesome theme for the central characters, the losers. That was a really, really good score, and it worked brilliantly in the film, and it made the film a more powerful experience. This... I was kind of let down with it because I think the entire score is cut from the same cloth, which is sort of dreamy, languid, more than a little portentous. It's the kind of score that undoubtedly accompanies a movie that thinks it's more intelligent than it is. Judging from the reviews, that's exactly what the film is. Apparently the film is beyond idiotic and has got a twist in it, which... I haven't even seen it, but I've read a description of the film. I think I've guessed what the twist actually is, which obviously I won't give away. But
I think I've guessed it from the score.
Right,
because if you look at the last few tracks, titles, I think it gives it away to some extent.
That's true. But I think the score is disappointingly repetitive, and there isn't enough variation in the tone of it for me, and the score pretty much starts and ends in exactly the same place with exactly the same kind of tone, using the same kind of textures, which is very languid, sustained strings, a little bit of an eerie chorale effect every now and then, which is very effective. I mean, the interesting thing is there's no attempt to score the location of the movie, which I think it was filmed in Mauritius. It's set in the Plymouth Islands or somewhere. There's no real attempt to do that, which is not necessarily a bad thing. You think of what, like John Barry with Out of Africa, he refused to score the landscape, he scored the characters. That's perfectly fine. But there also doesn't really appear to be any attempt to play up the noirish aspects of the characters, like Anne Hathaway's like the femme fatale who like apparently lures Matthew McConaughey's character in. There's no real attempt to address that. All of the score plays out in this kind of like, I hate to use the word, but slightly dreary, samey sound. Some of the material in there is very, very good. There's a track called The Girl at the Bridge, I think, which builds to some kind of beautiful choral crescendo. That's really nice. But they're isolated moments, and I think Benjamin Wallfisch has done better work elsewhere. I mean, certainly you listen to this, the vast majority of this score sounds like the softer moments from It, which was a vastly superior score to this, no doubt, because the film actually inspired him to do some really good work. I mean, obviously Stephen Knight, writer-director, has to foot the blame, as any director does, if there are failings in the music. A lot of that has to fall at the feet of the director for not maybe encouraging the composer to be as creative as they ought to be. It's not a terrible score. I thought there were beautiful moments in it, but I think Wallfisch he's done better elsewhere, I think. Yeah,
it feels a little flat, doesn't it? In at times, it just, like you say, it sort of doesn't really develop. It sort of goes around the houses, and it's a little dull, and that is a shame. I mean, by the sound of it, the film's anything but, in a way. It's going to be so wacky.
This is the point, because the film sounds utterly bonkers. So you think, okay, there's going to be a lot of like variations in the tone of the score. You think the score's going to go all over the place. Well, and it doesn't. The score just kind of, noodles its way around with every track pretty much sounding similar to the one before it, which I'm kind of surprised at. So there's obviously, Stephen Knight obviously got Wallfisch to underplay the tone of the score by the sounds of it, presumably because the film was so ridiculous. Maybe he thought, if I have overblown music in this, it will make the film even more ridiculous. I don't know, that's me speculating there. But
well, yeah, it could be. And it's also indicative maybe of the fact that they thought they were making a different film than they did, and it means they weren't all in tune. When you get a great score to a really good movie, like Black Panther, as a good example we talked about earlier, it all feels in sync. It all feels like they're all on the same page. They understand they've got this relationship. Whereas, maybe if this film is a bit mad and the score doesn't reflect that, it's because they didn't necessarily think this film was mad. They thought it fit more with what Wallfisch was doing. Who knows? I'm very curious to see how bad this film is. And the score definitely isn't bad. There are, like you say, there are moments in it. There are points where it's quite nice, and there are moments of interest. But it could have been better, I think. And I don't think it's necessarily going to stand out in the Wallfisch canon, but it's out there. If you're brave enough to take the film on, then take the score on. It's available now from Milan Records. So we're back with James Horner. We're going from a fairly dull score to some far from dull scores as we count down 7 to 5. So I'll kick us off with number 7, and I've gone for Deep Impact, which is another soft... I do like my soft Horner scores sometimes, I'm not going to lie. Another soft score from Mimi Leader film from 1998. One of the two asteroid movies of that year that were duking it out. And the one that always gets remembered is Armageddon, which I was happy to Armageddon out of there when I watched that. Because it's
very good.
Bloody awful. Thank you. I've never liked that film. I never will. And at that time it was the Aerosmith song that just dominated the charts for like 12 weeks or whatever it was. And it was all that, and Deep Impact got overlooked, even though Deep Impact is by far the better movie, and it's a far more ensemble, interesting way into the idea of an asteroid hitting the Earth, a far less aggressively American chauvinistic way of doing it. And Horner scores it really beautifully. He's got a real mix of stuff. The one that always sticks out to me is this beautiful piece called The Wedding, which is sort of the theme for Vanessa Redgrave's character, who sort of meets a bit of a sad end. The mother of Taya Leone's ostensible lead, and it's a really beautiful. He's got this piano theme that runs through a lot of the Deep Impact score in those softer moments, which is really beautiful. And I think there's a real mix. There's some more of that, perhaps slightly more militaristic, action based music at times in Deep Impact, but he always keeps a very emotional core to the score, and I love it for that. Yeah,
I think it's a disaster movie in which James Horner scores the people. He doesn't score the disaster, does he? And again, it almost seems counterintuitive, but James Horner was always a composer interested in romantic melody and in people. He wasn't necessarily a composer who was interested in hardware. He said after he reunited with James Cameron for Titanic, they made up their differences. He said he understood Titanic as a project a lot more than Aliens, and because Titanic had a human focus to it, a tragic focus. And I think obviously Deep Impact came out the year after Titanic, and there's a lot of Titanic in there. There's a lot of that melancholia, fragile beauty. Yeah, I think it's a perfectly pleasant Horner score. Actually, again, not one I've necessarily returned to regularly. I mean, I think if I'm thinking of his stuff from 1998, maybe The Mask of Zorro. I believe that was the same year. But
it was.
But yeah, it's. I mean, it shows that Horner could take this big budget material and bring it right down to earth and make you care about the people involved. That's a real skill.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's because I've always loved that movie. I remember watching it. I was 16 that summer, so it was one of those films. Alongside the X-Files movie that I just really stick in my head, in the summer of 1998. I think I've always loved the film, and the score's always resonated with me. It was a good year for Horner, I think, 98. Certainly on the basis of those two you mentioned. What's your number 7 then, Sean? What have you gone for?
So from 1998 to 1988 with The Land Before Time, anyone who was born in the late 80s, early 90s will remember this movie ripping their heart out. And James Horner's score is largely responsible for that. It's a Don Bluth animated movie about dinosaurs facing imminent extinction, and Littlefoot losing his mother, who then appears in ghostly visions later on. It's a heart-wrenching film. It's a film that I think made a lot of kids grow up when they watched it. I mean, obviously a lot of Disney films dealt with death of parents as well, but this one deals with it in a particularly profound way, I think. And what Horner's scored, Horner's score is magnificent, and it's when you listen to it on album, like Horner liked to score in big suites of music, like so 8 to 10 minute passages of music, and sometimes even longer, that hit a lot of very, very complicated beats along the way. He didn't often like to break up his film music into sort of little individual bitty pieces, and when you listen to the Land Before Time score, it unfolds like a ballet in a way. I believe there are six passages of music that range between 8 to 15 minutes. So what you get is this incredibly graceful dance around lots of very different emotions, lots of different themes. So you've got the valley theme, you've got the theme for Littlefoot and his mother, which is utterly heart-wrenching, and then you've of course got the Diana Ross song at the end. is it If We Hold On Together? I think right.
Maybe.
Yeah, and yeah, what it shows is that Horner was very, very accomplished at treating animated movies like they were serious drama. He didn't like Mickey Mousing and emphasising the sort of more obvious elements. He treated these movies with utmost seriousness. It's a shame that he stopped doing animated movies. I think after the mid-90s, I think Balto was the last animated movie that he did, which I think was in 1995, because he was brilliant at them. His capacity for coming up with tear-jerking melodies in films like Land Before Time was, unsurpassed, I think.
But yeah, it's a great choice, absolutely. I don't know if my number 6 is a masterpiece, but I mean it's one of my favourite films. I've gone for Clear and Present Danger, which is the Harrison Ford starring Jack Ryan adaptation, Tom Clancy, of the Tom Clancy book. A real favourite movie of mine from 1994. I love both of the Harrison Ford, Jack Ryan films. And Horner obviously scored Patriot Games, which was 92 as well. And I really like the music here. I think it's very militaristic. It's very, I guess in some respects, jingoistic. In some ways, it's very American. It's almost like you could wave the Stars and Stripes to some of this music, but at the same time, he sort of, one of the big things about Clear and Present Danger is that it's a film about the corruption of a president, essentially, although it's really, compared to what we've got in this day and age, it's very tame,
We'd rather have the movie version.
Yeah. Happily, the worst thing that happens in that film is Harrison Ford going, "Oh, Mr. President, you're against the law."
Yeah, if only we had a Harrison Ford going, "How dare you, sir?" Like that.
How dare you,
that
sir?
Stuff, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'd happily have the corrupt Mexican drug cartel president guy than who we've got right now. But so in a way, the film, in some ways, the film hasn't necessarily aged that well. But there's a real charm to it all, and I think Horner's music is, I suppose, not as prominent or as beautiful as some of his other scores, but I think, again, a bit like Deep Impact, I think it's a film I've loved since I was a kid, and I think the music's always just stuck with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a score that slips through the net with a lot of people, actually, myself included. It's not a Horner score that I return to regularly, but the end titles, which I think is called Truth Needs a Soldier, which I think is the end credits music, is that right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Which is brilliant. I mean, it brings everything to a kind of valedictory, cathartic sense of the resolution, because obviously the movie's got a lot of action, a lot of political intrigue in it. And again, I hate to keep flogging this particular dead horse, but there's the Horner self-plagiarism thing again, where there's a scene where Harrison Ford's trying to hack his colleague's computer, and then what you get is the opening bit of music from Aliens is used in it, but then you get the Horner like rumbling, crashing piano, as it's called, which was a really effective device to use that in a lot of and it's really startling, and it really raises the tension. But again, you listen to it thinking, I've heard this somewhere else before. Which can be a bit
brilliant though. That scene is the best. You never in the history of cinema are you going to find a better scene that's more tense, that involves two middle-aged white men printing out a piece of paper. It is astonishingly good.
and never has a piece of paper been so aggressively thrust when Harrison Ford does it.
If you watch that film, I've no idea how he doesn't rip that paper when he pulls it off the printer. It doesn't make any sense to me. He grabs it like he's wrestling it. Yeah. It's wonderful. I mean, that film is great. And like you say, that end theme, I think what he does in both of those movies, he scores a really great theme for Jack Ryan that it's a shame we haven't had carried through in many ways by subsequent composers in things like, The Sum of All Fears, and obviously that was Jerry Goldsmith, and that was a really good score. But it's a shame almost that theme hasn't sort of stuck with Jack Ryan through this, because it is a really, really good theme scored for a proper American hero in many respects, because Jack Ryan is ultimately a stand-up, defender of American values. So he does it really well, and I think there's lots to that score. It's one to rediscover, I think. And if you've not seen Clear and Present Danger, get on that, because it's a cracker. It's a cracking political 90s thriller.
Agreed.
What's your number 6 then, Sean?
It's Braveheart from 1995.
A biggie. Yeah.
What more needs to be said about Braveheart that hasn't been said? One of the pivotal scores in Horner's career, and again, as I mentioned earlier with reference to Balto, this was one of the scores that cemented him as a really extraordinary dramatist. Say what you will about the film, and to be honest, with every passing year, I find the film increasingly ridiculous and harder to take.
Yeah, it's not great, is it?
It's not great. There are strengths in it. The battle scene's brilliantly done, but it's an egotistical exercise. But there's no faulting James Horner's music. It's really quite beautiful. Apparently, this was the score that convinced James Cameron to reach out to James Horner and get him for Titanic, because James Cameron apparently was moved to tears listening to this particular score with the Chilean pipes and the Boran drum and strings, just crafting this very wistful, almost mystical sense of beauty and heroism, which again is because it's a movie that's looking into the distant past, and certainly with the score, you kind of get a sense that it's got a really transporting air of beauty and intrigue to it. I mean, obviously the two central themes, the Braveheart theme and the Freedom theme, which first emerges at the Battle of, I want to say, Stirling, Sons of Scotland, that bit. I think my Scottish accent there was worse than Mel Gibson's, which is saying something.
I don't think that's possible, Sean, don't worry.
I'll take that as a compliment. But the two central themes are so extraordinarily beautiful and resplendent in that romantic idiom that Horner loved to express so much. And Horner's infatuation with Celtic musicology, it was exercised to an increasingly almost parodic degree in like later scores, some of which didn't even deserve it. But clearly in this was the perfect outlet for that, the love of Celtic music. That would later flourish in the likes of Titanic. Yeah, this was an Oscar-nominated score. It's a fantastic. It's actually quite a dark score for a lot of it. There's a lot of quite primal, brutal material. Again, given the nature of the story and what it's dealing with, I think a lot of people forget there's a lot of quite murky, uncomfortable material in it, but it's counteracted by some of Horner's most majestically gorgeous melodic writing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, yeah, it is beautiful in many places. I think it has aged better than the film, definitely. So yeah, I agree. I think I can't put it better. I think that's a great choice. My number 5 is kind of an evolution from that, and you mentioned it. This one, while you were talking about it, I've gone for Titanic, which is probably the biggest film that Horner ever scored. For all the films he did, James Cameron's epic 1997 retelling of the Titanic sinking, a film everybody's seen. I think if you've not seen Titanic, then have you ever watched a movie? It's everybody's seen it, regardless of whether you think it's great or not. I mean, I've always thought that Titanic is great about 90 minutes in. That's when it kicks into gear.
when danger actually starts to
basically
set in, yeah.
When they hit the iceberg, ironically, the film doesn't go to shit. The film gets good as the situation.
Yeah, you've
goes
gone
to
through
shit.
all the kind of soppy romance in the first one. So just get on. Let's just get on with the actual story, shall we? Yeah.
And I need. It's been many years since I've seen it, and maybe as a mid-30s married man, I will enjoy the first 90 minutes more. Who knows? But there's no getting away from the fact that Horner's music is beautiful, throughout, and obviously. It's one of those things where that film, again, was one of those films that got overshadowed by Celine Dion and My Heart Will Go On, although as me and my friend coined, because we were at school when Titanic came out, for us it very quickly became The Hot Dogs Go On.
You did the old Mandela effect, did you?
Exactly, yeah, the Mengele effect, as they call it. But yeah, it's it was The Hot Dogs Go On. So whenever she sings it now, it's the hot dogs go on. Which and I defy any of you to get that out of your heads now. It's in there.
You've ruined it for everyone.
I've ruined it for all of you now. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's Horner's music's great. He really gets that Celtic feeling in with a lot of the sounds for Jack and Rose, and he captures that early 20th century high society glamour mixed with the rough and tumble of the underclass, you know, because Titanic is all about class. And it's all about class
you're talking about the Irish, all down on the road, that's where you...
It is very on the nose. You know, there's no getting away. I mean, he did a lot of this in Patriot games. He takes a lot that he did in Patriot games, where he scored the IRA like he was, you know, in an Irish pub playing the fiddle. Yeah, you know, it couldn't be more on the nose. But it was good. I think it gets you into that. And then when it becomes more percussive, as you know, as the ship's going down, and it builds on a lot of the stuff he's done before. He sort of brings a lot of this, brings the Braveheart stuff you've talked about with, you know, scores he's done before together. And I think it's good. You know, I think for a film which is flawed, I think he brings a great musical palette to it.
Yeah, I mean, it won him his first Oscar. And can I say I hate the Celine Dion song? I think it's awful. I mean, if we're talking about vocals within the soundtrack, what I love is Horner's use of the Norwegian soprano Sissel. It's her incredibly haunting voice that acts as like the lament for everyone who died on the Titanic. Whenever her voice is used in the score, it's enormously eerie and powerful. I mean, it shows Horner was a great dramatist. It's another one of those counterintuitive Horner scores. It uses new age instrumentation to score a turn of the 20th century story, which you think that wouldn't work, but it did. I mean, I think for that reason, I think this particular Horner score for me has dated a little bit more now than a lot of his other timeless orchestral works around the time. But it was an interesting decision to, apparently, I think a lot of that came from James Cameron as well, which was that, you know, try and lend a sense of the modern to a past tragedy, and it works very, very well in the film. But of course, when he does break out the orchestra, like the hard starboard scene when they hit the iceberg, that's an astonishingly well scored and spotted scene. I mean, anyone of our generation, I mean, anyone who was around when Titanic came out, I didn't see Titanic in the cinema because I was too young, but I saw it on video. That scene electrifies the attention, largely because of Horner's score, which throws back to Alien. There's great use for like anvil and strings, which incredibly urgent. And right from that moment, you know that the ship is doomed, completely doomed. So, yeah, actually, I mean, funnily enough, it's not in my top 10, which is kind of strange given that it was the score that got Horner the Oscar, and I think it's the best-selling soundtrack album of all time, I think. I don't think anything's topped it since. Yeah, I think for me, there are excellent moments in it. For me, it had to give way to other stuff, and I can just hear all the Horner fans now going, what? Yeah.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, are you about to prove your point with your number 5, Sean? Let's see.
Yeah, my number 5, Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. Wrath?
Yes!
Wrath? Did I say
Wrath.
That right? Wrath, yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully this will allay any of the controversy over what I've just said about Titanic. I don't think anyone would argue this being in the top 10 Horner scores of all time, because it is one of his defining works. It laid down a lot of the instrumental and tonal techniques that he would use in pretty much all of his ensuing sci-fi adventure fantasy scores. I mean, you think of like Krull, for example, and at the same time, this one also throws back to an earlier score that he'd done, Battle Beyond the Stars, the Roger Corman movie, which was so close to getting in my list, and I had to sacrifice it, which was a really hard thing to do. Wrath of Khan is brilliant. It's an interesting variation on Jerry Goldsmith's much more cerebral, atmospheric score for the motion picture. This is, without wishing to sound detrimental, Horner scores this as much more of a straightforward adventure with emphasis on the brass and lots of rhythmic, propulsive nature. I mean, you've got the battle in the Mutara Nebula sequence, which is one of Horner's early defining set pieces, which shows how well he can weave together musical action over the course of 6-7 minutes. It's incredible. And obviously the main Star Trek theme is now, immediately it became one of the most famous film themes of all time, and its sense of optimism and warmth and joy is, I'm sure you'd agree, it's brilliant. It's so great.
Yeah. I'm not gonna say too much about it because it is going to be in my top list in the next episode, but it is for me an absolute masterpiece. You know, I'm biased because The Wrath of Khan is my favourite sci-fi movie. It's one of my favourite movies of all time. I think the film's a masterpiece as well. But Horner's music, I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that film wouldn't be as good without this music. It just wouldn't. This music does so much to make that film as great as it is. You know, it does everything. It has amazing character themes for characters who already, you know, were well ingrained in popular culture. You know, Kirk, Spock, Khan himself. You know, it brings out themes for, you know, for the Enterprise, for Starfleet, that are different from the kind of things that Jerry Goldsmith did in the motion picture, which is equally a masterpiece, the previous score. Well, I mean, that's my favourite score of all time, the motion picture. So, but this isn't far away either. I mean, it's just brilliant. And like you say, the Battle in the Mutara Nebula and then the Genesis countdown after it are just... there are points in this music I'm both just thrilled and about to cry. And there's not many scores that do that for me, and it's, yeah, I think it's fantastic. You know, and he then went on and did a really great one after that. You know, even for a less great movie, for The Search for Spock, but that's a great score as well. So the 2 Star Trek scores he did were both phenomenal.
Yeah, they're career-defining scores, and certainly if you listen to Krull, which is another one of those Horner Fantasy scores that was so close to getting in my top 10, Krull's an extraordinary score that you can hear a lot of Star Trek in that. As indeed you can hear a lot of the rhythmic devices from Star Trek in Aliens. The Wrath of Khan was such an extraordinary, influential and career-defining score for Horner. I think it was probably the one that announced him to Hollywood, probably more so than any others. I mean, he'd worked with Roger Corman, came up through the low-budget B-movie ranks. I mean, Battle Beyond the Stars is a masterful score, but I think Wrath of Khan is the one that made people go, wow, who is this guy? You know, he's really, really good. We've got to get him to score our 1980s fantasy sci-fi movie, whatever. It worked.
Yeah, and quite rightly, because it is wonderful. So we'll be back for a countdown of the 4-1 scores from James Horner in the next episode. So if that's not a reason to tune back in next time, I don't know what is. Okay, so you've been listening to Snowplow from Cold Pursuit, scored by George Fenton, and this, of course, is a film starring Liam Neeson, who stars as Nelson Coxman, who is Nels Coxman, as he's a snowplow driver who goes after a local drug lord after the murder of his son. It's a remake of a film from Norway from 2014 called In Order of Disappearance, directed by Hans Petter Molland, and it's a film. It's a film that's, I mean, there's two ways to look at this, right? It's a film that's either been overshadowed by Liam Neeson not doing himself any favours in the press lately, or Liam Neeson is a PR genius because he's made people aware of a film that would have absolutely vanished and been completely ignored by almost everybody, because I think it would have been overshadowed by half a dozen different things. The Oscars, Captain Marvel coming out, Avengers, Game of Thrones, all kinds of things. And I don't know where you stand on it, but I think you know, more people know about Cold Pursuit, and maybe we know about Fenton's score because of all this that's been going on with Neeson. Yeah,
well, I think somewhat ironically, it's been overshadowed anyway. It hasn't really had very much. It hasn't had very much praise, has it? Regardless of what Liam Neeson. So Liam Neeson has both shot himself in the foot, and the movie is being sort of consigned as a bit of a footnote, which is kind of ironic, really.
What about the score, though? I mean, because George Fenton's a funny one, isn't he? Because he's been around for a donkey's years. You know, he was doing stuff like Dangerous Liaisons in the 80s, but he's not a major name, is he? And he's, you know, this score, I'm not going to lie, I don't know about it, you might have liked it more than me, but it didn't do much for me.
Well, it's very different from a lot of the other stuff. I mean, George Fenton is very famous as a symphonic composer. He puts a lot of emphasis on melody and beauty, and you think, yeah, Dangerous Liaisons is an excellent example. You think also like Memphis Belle, Ever After. I suppose to a lot of people, he was best known for formerly being the BBC's in-house natural history composer, because he did Blue Planet, Planet Earth, and so on. And those scores are majestic. I saw him conduct segments from the Planet Earth score live in Bristol, and it was tremendous. It was a really powerful experience. So, bearing in mind, I've just said this is a very different score from him. I mean, what it is, I've seen our mutual acquaintance John Broxton of Movie Music UK, one of the best film music critics out there, made the comparison to Carter Burwell's Fargo, and I think that is right. It's a use of unusual instrumentations to give a kind of folksy, homespun, quirky little Blackley comic feel, really. I mean, there's very little action music in the score, given that it's Liam Neeson and he's going to go around and, you know, take revenge on people. There isn't actually that much action music in the score. It seems to have been done more with a Blackley comic intent, which is interesting. But Fenton has done electronic stuff before, because back at the very start of his career, he did The Company of Wolves for Neil Jordan, and that was an electronic score, and it worked brilliantly. It was a very, very effective, creepy score that sort of, it was almost at odds with the classically fairy tale visuals, but it worked. But clearly in this, what you've got is there are samples from Dan Carey, who is a British producer and arranger, and there are proper full-on like sort of samples, mixed sections in it, which are very, very contemporary, and I can only assume that Fenton called on him to maybe help give the score a bit more of a modern kick to it. Though those sections are interesting, I actually thought the score was quite interesting. I thought there's a clutch of interesting, like quite melancholy, bittersweet themes in it. I preferred it to the Serenity soundtrack. I thought it was more varied and more distinctive than that. It's maybe not a George Fenton score that I'm going to go back to. I mean, certainly I'm not going to listen to this anywhere near as regularly as I would something like Planet Earth. But it's nice to hear a composer showing a different side to themselves. I mean, George Fenton doesn't do an awful lot of films now. I think recently he did things like Lady in the Van and The Zero Theorem, but he doesn't score half as many movies as he used to. I mean, The Fisher King was another one that he did back in the early 90s, which had a really nice score to it. So it's nice to see him still working, really. It's just a shame that the score has been attached to a film that, regardless of what Liam Neeson says, is a bit of a footnote.
Yeah, and despite, you know, unintentional or intentional, depending on how you want to look at it, efforts, yeah, it's kind of vanished. Yeah, it has vanished, admittedly. And yeah, I didn't love it, really. I can totally see where, you know, when you talk about how John Broxton mentioned the Carter Burwell links, I did feel that, definitely. You know, it was surprisingly quirky in places, but then it just goes off into this very synthetically sort of atonal, you know, gritty stuff, and that isn't very nice to listen to. I suppose it would work potentially with some of the action music, but then, yeah, it seemed very all over the place to me, and it didn't engage me in that sense that Burwell scores often do. So yeah, I was quite detached from it, really. I am going to watch the movie because, you know, I like Liam Neeson just going around thumping heads, but I don't know. I think it'd be nice to see Fenton doing stuff that's maybe a little bit more skewed towards the kind of things he was doing before. But yeah, it's not one for me. Mixed bag. Although I have heard people say they've really liked it and it's gone down well. So maybe like the film, it's sort of slightly divided people who have listened to it. So it's maybe one to check out. You can get it now from Varese Sarabande Records. We're nearly done. We're just going to do a little bit of a wrap-up. We're going to see any other business, and we've got a couple of other little albums we're going to briefly talk about. Sean, you wanted to bring up something from the start of February, which is a rare Junkie XL score that you actually like.
You anticipated exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, Alita Battle Angel.
Oh, I'm so predictable.
Robert Rodriguez movie, produced by James Cameron. So yeah, what did it for you this time?
Yeah, actually, it's quite nice, isn't it, to bring it back full circle with James Cameron, given I started my James Horner list with Aliens. I didn't think about that. Junkie XL, to give him his actual name, Tom Holkenborg, which he now appears to be going by. I think he appears to be sort of sidelining the Junkie XL moniker. He has delivered a series of scores in the past of which I've not been fond. Very aggressively industrial, processed. Kind of, you think of things like Deadpool and Tomb Raider more recently, and bits of Mad Max Fury Road, which I really didn't like, although I did like other bits of that score that acquired some more elegiac moments. Yeah, I'm not a fan of his very aggressively harsh sort of quasi-industrial. It's just not my sort. It's not my cup of tea, to quote Spike Lee from the Oscars.
But that was great.
this score, wow, this completely took me by surprise. I imagine. For one thing, it's easily the best thing that Tom Holkenborg has ever done. It's really melodic. It's really soulful. I'm assuming that one of the central tenets of it is to use a full orchestral and choral symphony to give soul to the main character played by Rosa Salazar, who is an android with no memory who's trying to discover who she was. I'm assuming that was the jumping off point for the score. I also wouldn't be surprised if James Cameron, in his role as writer and producer, said to Robert Rodriguez, look, you want a score that sounds like James Horner. You want a score that would sound as if James Horner was going to do this. I would not be surprised if that was one of the central driving sort of aesthetics behind it, because it does sound like James Horner, and that's a really, really good thing. That's what it needs to sound like. The main theme for Alita herself is really beautiful and long lines, and really picks the film up. It works very well in the film. I didn't think the film was that bad. It's kind of struggled at the box office, I think, although it's done well in China, I believe. The film is pretty generic. It's not terrible. I thought the score stood out very, very well in it. It gives, again, a kind of soul and beauty which contrasts very powerfully with the sort of post-apocalyptic landscape that you see on the screen. And I think it's easily Holkenborg's most sophisticated and accomplished score to date. And I think, you know what, score more like this, please. He can clearly do it, and he's a smart guy. I've seen loads of interviews with him. He's really engaged, really switched on, and maybe it's the case that again, to go back to an earlier point I made, maybe it's the directors who are at fault, the directors who encourage this kind of fairly naff industrial ear-bleeding noise. They presumably say to sort of Tom Holkenborg, right, we've got you on for this score, but we want it to sound like that score from that other person, sort of sub Hans Zimmer thing. And I'm really, really glad that James Cameron and Robert Rodriguez didn't get him to do that in this, with the exception of the Motorball track, which is at the end of the album, but I'll forgive that because there's been so much brilliant stuff elsewhere. Yeah, I thought it was really great. Loved it.
I need to go back to it, you know. I have listened to it, but it didn't strike me in the same way. But I think maybe I was expecting something different. You know, I mean, I love the Mad Max Fury Road score. I'm not going to lie. I've always really liked that. And, you know, Deadpool didn't do anything for me, nor did his Tomb Raider one, really. And, you know, I appreciate that music a little more than you do. But this, you know, I need to rediscover it. I need to go back and have another listen, because there's clearly stuff in there that I've missed. So that's going to be exciting to do. So yeah, that's one to have a look at. A recent film that's just come out as of the weekend we record is a film called The Aftermath, starring Keira Knightley, another Keira Knightley period drama. We've had two this year.
Yeah, following Colette, wasn't it? Yeah,
following Colette, which itself had a beautiful score, which I think we talked about before. And this has got a great score by Martin Phipps, a British composer, and it's just lovely. It's really surprised me. You know, the film, I don't know a lot about the film, but the score is really brooding, classical, sonorous, very melodic. It's, you know, there's a wartime aspect to the movie, and there's some really amazing moments where you actually hear like the bombs going off of wartime bombs echoing in the background of this music at the same time. I thought it was fantastic. It really stood out to me as one of the best scores so far of the year.
Yeah, I really liked it as well. Again, I haven't seen the film. It's not had great reviews, but the score is beautiful. Yeah, no, I completely agree. The use of the bomb sound effects in the opening track kind of grabs the attention, but then it moves into this extraordinarily beautiful theme for Keira Knightley's character, which is gorgeous. I mean, that's got to go down as one of the most beautiful pieces of film music so far this year. And as I understand, I mean, the movie is based on a novel, and from what I've read about the film, there's a piano which is one of the central kind of objects, symbols in the story, and then the way that her theme is translated onto the piano by Martin Phipps, presumably in a moment of self-realization or self-awareness, whatever. I mean, I'm assuming that's what happens during the scene that music accompanies. It's gorgeous. It's really nice. And yeah, I mean, Martin Phipps, he works a lot. I think he works a lot on like BBC dramas, things like War and Peace and things. I think he deserves more films, because this really caught me off guard. I wasn't really expecting an awful lot from it. Having heard that the film was pretty dull, I was expecting a bit of a lachrymose, maybe slightly languid, unremarkable score. And the melodic ideas in it are really emotionally direct and really piercing. Yeah, really good score, actually.
Real surprise of this month, of this year. So there must be something about Keira Knightley being in films lately with great scores, great classical scores.
Well, yeah, I mean, generally you think of what Dario Marianelli did for Atonement, which won an Oscar. Yeah, she clearly, and Rachel Portman for The Duchess and Never Let Me Go as well. Yeah, there's a lot of great scores for Keira Knightley movies. Maybe that could be a theme in a future podcast or something.
Maybe. If it gives us a chance to play Anna Karenina,
yes,
then I'm all for it.
Yeah, that's a great score, yeah.
That's a beautiful score. So yeah, check out Alita Battle Angel and the Aftermath in terms of scores. Pretty great scores to fairly, average films. But that's stuff to look into. But that's where we're going to call it a day for this episode of Between the Notes, and we think it's fitting really to celebrate the Oscar success of Black Panther. We're going to play you out with a orchestral piece from that film, scored by the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra and orchestrated by Robert Ziegler. And this is part of a new album from Sony Music Masterworks called Ultimate Superheroes, Music to Save the World To. And it's the Czech Philharmonic Orchestra playing a varied list of pieces from all kinds of different superhero movies of the last few years. So The Dark Knight Rises, Guardians of the Galaxy, Suicide Squad, Superman. So going back to Superman, X-Men 2, things like that. So it's a fun album, and we're going to play the United Nations and End Titles theme, part of that from Black Panther, which is I think it's a great ending double header of a piece, Sean. I mean, I think it ends. It's got one of those really bravura sort of brings it all together final tracks, which just make you want to punch the air as you leave the cinema. Yeah,
it's really, really cathartic, isn't it? Ludwig Göransson really makes you feel like you've been on a journey with these characters. I mean, under the baton of Robert Ziegler, who's one of the great conductors, one of the great interpreters of other people's film music as well. This is spectacular. Yeah, I couldn't think of best treatment for this particular Oscar-winning score.
Yeah, so well done again to Black Panther, and we'll play you out with this. We will be back soon for another episode of Between the Notes, but as always, thanks for listening to the music and to us, and we'll see you next time. Between the Notes is produced and edited by Tony Black, who hosts alongside Sean Wilson. You can find Tony on Twitter at AJBlackWriter and Sean on Twitter at Seano22. You can find Between the Notes on Twitter at BTW_notes, on iTunes, your podcast app of choice, on Spotify, Stitcher and on Spreaker, where the show is part of the We Made This podcast network. For more podcasts all about TV, film, books, music and popular culture in general, you can find We Made This on Facebook and on Twitter at We Made This Pod. Thanks for listening.